Hello, my name is Sarah Place. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer with Elanco Animal Health, and I'm here today to talk to you about how dairy is a critical part of a sustainable food system. So to get started, when we think about sustainability, this is an issue that can definitely have lots of different meanings and many complex meanings. And so I like to display sustainability in this way of the idea of a Venn diagram, where we have many important factors that are overlapping. We have pretty wide agreement that we have three main domains of sustainability that are incredibly important: the environment, or the ecological aspects of sustainability, economic, and social aspects. So within this Venn diagram, you can see some examples of some of the issues that are important when it comes to sustainability as we think about our food system. So everything from environmental footprints, which often get most of the attention, things like carbon and water footprints, but also things like land use and optimized land use, as well as social issues like nutritional health, nutritional quality, culture of both the producers and eaters of food, and economic issues. Of course, criteria number one for sustainability, we think about sustainable food production, is that people have to be able to make a living while doing it. And of course, people have to be able to afford the food. So all of these complex issues are what we're trying to balance as once when we talk about sustainability. And ultimately, sometimes there are synergies and sometimes there are trade-offs when we talk about this issue. But the last thing I'd want to draw your attention to, and this is what makes sustainability difficult, is that last bullet point on the left-hand side of the slide, right? That there are a lot of value judgments at play when we think about sustainability, especially when we talk about food systems, because ultimately we're asking questions about what should we do and what should we eat. And those are not objective questions, right? These are things that have value judgments that come into play. So for example, everyone may agree that all these things that are listed on the slide are important, but they may rank them differently, right? And that doesn't mean necessarily that one person is right or wrong. Rather, we have different priorities, and that can be part of the challenge when we discuss sustainability. Is we're all trying to balance these things and have discussions that fit society that has many different viewpoints. And so again, that's just a setup to talk about sustainability, and that there are sometimes no perfect answers, even though we should, of course, be using science and evidence to guide us through some of these discussions. So with that said, that very general opening of sustainability, if we think about some of the key issues that are related to dairy and sustainability, I'll kind of go over some of these at a high level and then finish up with more information about greenhouse gas emissions. But you have some excellent other speakers that will cover some of these things that I will bring up in much more in depth, which is excellent. So I'll give you a bit of a primer as we go through here. So the first thing is, we think about sustainability, something that often comes up just in general with livestock, and especially with dairy cattle too, is the idea of resource competition, right? That we have a situation where cattle are either directly eating what could be human food, and therefore reducing the human food supply by eating that food, or they are using lands that could be put to better use, right? So again, this idea of the value judgments, it could be producing more land if we were not using it for cattle production. So what are some of the facts and fiction on this issue? So if we look at just purely the amount of feed that is fed to livestock in the world, and look at how much of that is potentially human edible, this data comes from the UNFAO, and looking at this issue and saying, you know, of this 6 billion tons of dry matter, which is on the left-hand side in this pie chart, what is actually in direct competition with human food? So if you look at this slide, essentially the takeaway is 86% of what global livestock consume is not directly in competition with human food. And when I say livestock, this is inclusive of dairy cattle, but much broader than that, right? So this includes beef cattle, it includes all small ruminants, goats and sheep, it includes poultry and pigs, right? So all of this together, all of these species combined, 86% of what they consume is not directly in competition with human food. So that is the direct competition piece. The other thing that's on the slide is this quote, which is actually really highlights the strength of ruminants, and that for every 0.6 kilograms of human edible protein these animals consume, they return 1 kilogram of protein in the form of meat and milk. So this is really what we think of as upcycling. So essentially taking something that's a little or no value and making a higher value product. And ruminants are excellent at that in our food system, dairy cattle included, in terms of their ability to return more human edible protein than they consume. And I'll expand on that a little bit more on this slide here. We can think about feed conversion efficiency expressed a few different ways. And really this example on the slide here just highlights, again, with sustainability, you can present data differently and come to different conclusions. And this is part of the challenge as well. One high level aspect we're looking at, feed conversion efficiency, can have a few different answers, right? So what we're doing on this slide here is comparing feed conversion efficiency of grain finished beef. So this is from a life cycle perspective from the US, dairy cattle, and this is a UK example here of dairy cattle and one of a replacement heifer behind the cow, broiler chickens, and pork. Okay, so we're comparing feed conversion efficiency in a few different ways. The first column here that is in black is just purely the pounds or the kilograms of dry matter per pound of live weight gain for the meat animals and per pound of fresh milk for the dairy cow. So when we look at the feed conversion efficiency this way, right, especially if we zoom in on those meat producing animals, there is a dramatic difference between the monogastric species, right, pigs and chickens, and cattle, right? It's simply the physiology of these animals, the fact that it takes longer for them to reach maturity, and there's more maintenance energy, maintenance requirements in the herd for these animals, and the fact that they're a ruminant, right? We're feeding the bugs first before we feed the animal. So there are more pounds required, right? Dairy looks good here, of course, because partially we're looking at a fresh weight basis, right? We're accounting for all the water and milk. But the difference between the ruminant and the monogastric is really key and something that gets highlighted often in sustainability discussions. However, one of the challenges of this is really if we think about feed conversion efficiency as a way to express this idea of resource competition, just looking at the pounds of dry matter doesn't really tell us much, right? We're not actually getting at this competition aspect of the feed food competition. So that's what the second column is, right? What are the pounds of human edible feed? So in this case, mostly corn and soy, right? Things that are potentially human edible per pound of live weight, or again, per pound of fresh weight milk. And when we look at it this way, again, if we just really focus on those meat animal species, right, comparing beef with pork and chicken, a lot of those differences go away. And this really comes back to the fact that because monogastric animals, they're like us, they're monogastric omnivores, pigs and chickens are, they have to eat more potentially human edible feed, right? As compared to cattle, which again spend most of their time grazing, and with the case of dairy cattle, of course, are usually eating a 50% plus forage diet, right? So there's just less direct competition with the ruminant species as compared to the monogastric species. The third column, this is a little bit different if you haven't thought about feed conversion efficiency this way. This is what we call net protein contribution. So this is looking at feed conversion efficiency as we've been talking about it and flipping it on its head and saying, what is the protein value of beef or milk or pork or chicken? The protein value to people, meaning what is the amino acid composition and how available or how digestible are those amino acids in the protein source, versus that same quality measure of the human edible feed puts going into these animals, right? So again, in this case, we're flipping it on its head and we're saying essentially a higher value is better. If we have a value above 1, that means the system itself is actually returning more high quality protein, more of these essential amino acids that are highly digestible than using, right? So when you look at that third column, you'll notice both beef and dairy cattle are well above 1, right? Dairy cattle are actually the highest in this example, right? They're at 2.8, right? So returning far more high quality protein than the system itself, than the animals are using. Compared to chickens and pigs, right? In those situations, because those animals, again, are monogastric omnivores, they don't have rumen bugs that they can get their protein requirements from. They have to eat more high quality protein directly. And because of that, that actually lowers that ratio for them. So again, the takeaway from this is you can express data a few different ways and get a few different answers, right? Transparently, my bias is the the right-hand column, right? This net protein contribution is probably more relevant if we think about feed food competition. But also this just highlights that each one of these species plays its own unique role in the food system, right? Pigs and chickens are incredibly efficient at converting dry matter, right? They're really good at what they do. But there are advantages to ruminants in terms of using human inedible plants and upgrading them to higher quality proteins. So again, that's the main takeaway there, is that there can be a ruminant advantage there. The trade-off is the methane they produce, and we'll expand upon that a little bit later. which is right now in terms of the emissions. So if we look at the emissions, specifically greenhouse gas emissions from dairy, right, we can look at the EPA data just to kind of give us an objective source in the US of what are some of the trends and what are some of the main emission sources. So just to start a little bit of context here, what are the main emission sources in the United States? Is this the 2018 data, right? So from last year's greenhouse gas emission inventory from the EPA. Around 9–10%, depending on how we allocate energy emissions of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States come from agriculture, okay? And about 4% come from animal ag, and the balance come from plant agriculture. And so plant agriculture, a lot of this is actually soil nitrous oxide, so the emissions that come from the soil directly, which can be nitrogen coming from manure, or a lot of it is synthetic nitrogen. I've called out here specifically, right, U.S. dairy from a life cycle perspective emits about 1.9% of emissions, right? And so you'll see these dotted lines. What that's referring to is that's saying when we account for the crops that go to dairy cattle, when we account for emissions associated with transporting milk, with processing milk, getting it all the way to the consumer, it's 1.9% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, that's why those dotted lines are there to those other sectors. What's clear though, right, when you look at this slide is that fossil fuels really dominate the emissions profile of the United States, right? Transportation, electricity combined are over half of our emissions. That all other human emissions category includes things like residential emissions, right? Burning fuel oil, for example, to heat homes and buildings. So almost 80% of US emissions come from burning fossil fuels. So that really dominates our emissions profile. And the last thing I put on here is landfills, right? So landfills are an interesting source because of the #1 source of material that goes into landfills that actually produces methane gas, which is what that 1.7% is food waste. And so we think about the whole food system. This is a great example of the end of the life cycle of food can still have an impact, right? And food waste is a key waste because essentially we have waste on both ends, right? We have waste of producing human edible food that never actually went to nourish anyone. And then we have the waste of the fact that we're still producing emissions when that waste product is disposed of, right? So it's kind of a double whammy there. So that's why there's always been a lot of attention, or there usually is a lot of attention on anything we can do to reduce waste throughout the supply chain, especially at the consumer end, is a key win from a sustainability standpoint. So if we zoom in on that sliver of emissions that come from dairy, what are the actual trends, right? And actually looking at the direct emissions that come from dairy cattle and their manure. So to orient you on this graph, on the y-axis, we have million metric tons of CO2 equivalents going from 1990 to 2018. Okay. So there's a few things happening here. One, milk production, that's on the other y-axis, right? That's that line with the dots. Milk production itself in aggregate in the United States is up 47%, right? So we have growing production of milk in the United States. Not a surprise to anybody that's listening to this presentation, right? But we also have an increase in total greenhouse gas emissions, right? What we can call the absolute emissions that come from dairy indirectly. They're up 38%. And really, as you look at this graph, you'll see who the main culprit is there in terms of the gas. It is manure methane emissions is the big growth category, if you will. So those emissions are up 120%, 2018 compared to 1990. A lot of that is driven by the shift in dairies in the United States in terms of to more consolidated dairies that are classified often as large CAFOs. And because of that, from a water quality standpoint and protecting water quality, they tend to handle their manure in liquid lagoon systems, right? Anaerobic lagoon systems. Those type of lagoons, if they're uncovered, they can produce a fair amount of methane gas. And so really that's why that light green portion on this graph has increased as much as it has over time, has been the shift in demographics of dairies. Enteric methane is up slightly in terms of total amount, manure nitrous oxide as well. But again, the real growth category there is manure methane emissions. So what if we look at this on an intensity basis, right? So this is essentially taking those three main emission sources from the EPA and dividing it by the total milk production in each one of those years to get an intensity, right? So again, greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk, that's what's on the y-axis on this graph. and then our three main categories again. So again, what you'll see is because we've increased milk production so much, actually our enteric methane emissions intensity has gone down over time, right, by 25%. Manure nitrous oxide emissions intensity has also declined by 21%, but manure methane emissions intensity has actually increased, right? And you can kind of see that trend over time. The last 10 years or so, it's been fairly stable, but there's been this increase from the early 90s until right in the 2008, 2009 time. And again, that's mainly because of that shift to different manure management systems within the United States. So when we look at things like this, right, and I'll expand on this later, and some of the other talks will as well, right, but this kind of highlights, well, what are some of those key areas? If we want to reduce the carbon footprint of U.S. dairy, we can look at these main areas as contributors, and especially, again, that focus on manure methane. That's why there's so much attention on anaerobic digestion and other manure treatment options, because that's really tackling an emission source that has grown over time. So as we provide some of this information on emissions and some of this information on resource competition, what often happens in this discussion is there's essentially this dichotomy between making arguments that we should just reduce dairy demand versus doing things within the supply chain to reduce emissions, right? So this essentially, we can boil it down to this kind of this one question, right? Can we eat our way out of climate change? Can we change the way we consume food to reduce emissions is often a question that's posed. And I would say this is actually the impetus behind a lot of newer generation, if you will, alternative proteins. Here I have pictured some of the examples that are on the alternative meat side of things, but of course there are different dairy alternative companies that are also using an environmental angle to market their products, essentially saying, eat our product to eat your way out of climate change, right? So with this slide here is just showing, again, we got Impossible and Beyond, and I think the marketing materials of Beyond that are in the upper right-hand corner of the slide are kind of interesting, right? We have four main areas that they're talking about how they affect essentially sustainability, right? They improve human health. We can kind of question that if we actually look at the nutrition facts panel. They say that they're positively impacting climate change, and they use CO2 superscript, which of course is an actual chemical formula. They say they're addressing global resource constraints. So what I just talked to you about feed food competition, right? They're leaning into that issue. And then the last one is improving animal welfare, right? So they didn't kill an animal, so they're improving animal welfare. So I think this just highlights, right? There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of interest in people wanting to do the right thing by their food choices, especially younger generations that want to see change, want to see a positive aspect. And these companies have really leaned into that and leaned into these sustainability messages that are related to human health, environmental health, and animal health and well-being and welfare, right? And again, we see the same thing on the dairy side. So what is the answer to the question? Can we eat our way out of climate change? And hopefully some context, thinking back to that slide I showed you of US greenhouse gas emissions, it's self-evident that because agriculture is such a smaller contributor relative to fossil fuels, that just addressing food alone will not do the trick, if you will, right? And even digging a little bit deeper, this study that came out a few years ago and was published in the Proceedings of National Academies of Sciences kind of highlights some of the trade-offs that are present in this idea of dietary change. So they looked at a scenario that is admittedly unrealistic to ever happen, but essentially puts an upper bound on what's possible within the confines of the United States with dietary change, and if we could actually reduce emissions in a dramatic fashion through dietary change. So what if every American went vegan? What if we truly got rid of all livestock magically in the United States and got rid of all of their waste and all of their emissions? What would that actually do to greenhouse gas emissions? So they found it would indeed reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2.6 percentage points, which is less than 0.5% of global emissions. But there are some trade-offs for doing this, right? The key one is that from a nutritional standpoint, we would have some limitations, right? If we just think about the US food supply, the main source of some really key micronutrients is animal source foods. And specifically, if we think about vitamin B12, which is absolutely essential for human diets, it only comes in animal source foods, right? So we would remove this critically essential micronutrient, right, from the human food supply if we truly got rid of all animals and all animal source foods. So that would not be good, to just put it mildly, right? The other thing is there are trade-offs in terms of emissions, right? So as you look at this headline on the slide, you may recall just from a few slides ago, right? I told you animal agriculture directly emits about 4% of US emissions, but in this case, we're actually not reducing emissions by 4%. And why? Because we have some consequences, right? If we get rid of animals in our food system, there are other things that will happen as consequences. So if we look at this bar chart on the slide, the plus animals scenario is actually emissions as they were in 2010, right? So again, you see that it's about a 4% of those emissions, is what that 300 million metric tons represents, come from animals directly, with the balance from crop production, right? Some of those crops are absolutely being fed to animals, but in this scenario that these researchers looked at in the minus animals, where we truly get rid of all livestock, they assume, of course, farmers aren't just going to stop farming because there's now no more livestock, right? They're still probably going to produce crops that are going to be used domestically and likely would be exported, right? Because these are crops that are well suited, things like corn and soy, for example, in the corn belt of the United States. So because of that, we're still going to be producing crops. We'll have to replace things like manure, right? If we don't have that recycling of nitrogen and phosphorus within the agricultural system and manure nutrients returning to cropland, we'll have to use more synthetic fertilizers. So as you look at that minus animal scenario, you'll notice there's increased nitrous oxide emissions, essentially from synthetic fertilizer, and the same from legume production, because we'll need to, as humans, eat more, of course, legumes to meet our protein requirements, because we have no animal source foods in this scenario, and we'll need the nitrogen credits for the soil. The main takeaway from this is there are trade-offs. There is no free lunch. You can't eat your way out of climate change, right? This is, again, extremely dramatic scenario, but hopefully this is intuitive as well, that if this is the maximum reduction in emissions from truly eliminating, right, having one final giant barbecue, getting rid of all of our farm animals, that it's unlikely that a dietary change that's much more minor or one person making a difference in their diet is going to scale to anything. Right? Again, not to deter people from trying to do their part, but hopefully the math here is pretty clear in terms of the dietary change piece is a very difficult way to change emissions in a significant manner, right? Just because of all these consequences. And mainly because the food system is incredibly intertwined, right? In a lot of these type of publications or debates, it's presented as a bifurcated, there's either plants or there's animals, and you can eat a plant-based diet or an animal-based diet, and that masks the reality that, of course, people are omnivores, and our food system is omnivorous too. Our agricultural system is, and it's totally intertwined. So just an example here, right? We can think about if you make your way through a grocery store and you look at different products on the shelf, there's a story there that's right. Often these things are actually connected in the supply chain in various ways. And here we can look at an example of 3 breakfast beverages, right? We got orange juice, almond milk, and then cow's milk. And I put here kind of tongue in cheek, right? The original plant-based milk. So how are these things actually connected? And they are, even just within the state of California, right? Where all 3 of these things get produced, maybe even really in close geographic location to one another. So if we think about how we make orange juice, right? We take the whole orange, we squeeze it, right? We have citrus pulp that gets left over after the juicing process. With almond hulls, we have lots of byproducts, including, almonds, the whole of the almond, right? The actual fruit part of the almond that gets left over. Both of these things are pretty common staples in California dairy cow diets, right? We mix those things together in a TMR and a cattle casserole. We feed it to the animals. So those waste products would be waste products, byproducts from crop production, the parts of the plant that we cannot consume end up going into dairy cattle diets, right? And because again, these animals are ruminants and they're able to eat all these human indigestible, edible items, we can get further extraction of the nutrients and energy that come from these plants, come from orange production and come from almond production. So hopefully that makes sense. None of this is either or, even though it sometimes gets presented that way. And indeed, this integration piece and actually strengthening the integration between plant and animal ag is really key. From a circularity principle perspective, and just for the fact, this stat down here in the bottom of the slide, right? So every 100 pounds of human food that comes from crops, we got about 37 pounds of byproducts that get generated. So that's a lot of plant material that we don't want to go to a landfill and make methane gas, right? We would rather run it through an animal and extract more nutrients and energy from it, take the manure nutrients, put it back on the cropland, right? Have this cycle of nutrients and energy cycling through the process and extract as much as we can by wisely using animals within our food system as well. So that's a bit of the story, right? So, can you eat your way out of climate change? Most likely not, right? And also the reality of some of the ways that dietary trends are heading is there's no evidence of wide-scale change. So we're going to have to produce more animal source food. That is the reality as we have 2 billion more people coming to dinner in the next 30 years, and we have increasing incomes. Dairy protein, other animal source proteins are going to be very important. So how do we improve enough, and can we, right, to essentially not stress the planet further and do our part to reduce our impact on the climate, and especially opportunities to reduce methane emissions? So I'd say I would applaud the industry across the board, whether it's the U.S. dairy industry, individual companies have really stepped up their game in terms of making commitments, right? And a lot of it has been focused on this idea of net zero, essentially trying to balance reductions in CO2 equivalent emissions, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and increase carbon sequestration to essentially precipitate no more climate impact, right, by 2050. So this is an overarching goal of the economy and kind of the basis of some of the agreements that are out there, the Paris Climate Accords, right, of doing our part to get to this future. And dairy has taken on the same focus, right? With dairy and with agriculture, it's more challenging, right? Because some of our emissions are not as straightforward maybe as tailpipe emissions. They are coming from microbes. They're difficult to measure. They're difficult to control. But there are huge opportunities there too, especially when it relates to methane emissions, because there's more bang for your buck, if you will, of reducing these emissions. So just to get a more of a complete picture, right? I told you that U.S. dairy from a life cycle perspective is 1.9% of emissions, and I drew those dotted lines to different aspects of the U.S. economy. But this is a nice visual, a lot of information on this slide, but this comes from the U.S. dairy industry funded life cycle assessment that was done over a decade ago now, that really looked at the whole supply chain and looked at where are those hotspots along the supply chain, from growing feed to getting food, dairy foods to people. Where are the emissions that happen along the supply chain? And so as you look at this bar chart on the right-hand side, right, this is showing you where those emissions are coming from in terms of the emission footprint of milk, right? Kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk that gets consumed in the United States. And then the different colors there are showing you what type of gas it is, right? So when we go over to the consumer end of the supply chain, right? Processing, retail, et cetera, right? It's dominated by carbon dioxide. And this really comes down to, again, we're using fossil energy to move that milk, to process that milk, right? The consumer's using it to refrigerate their milk, et cetera, right? So that really dominates. When we get over to the farm side, it's more dominated by methane, especially, and nitrous oxide to a lesser degree, right? And again, these are gases that are coming from microorganisms, coming from manure, coming from the animal's gut and soil. So how can we reduce these emissions? Well, it's kind of straightforward, right? If you look at these bar charts, what are the main areas and how could we reduce it, especially on farm? We can reduce emissions from feed production, right? Reducing the actual emissions associated with growing the feed, reducing nitrous oxide emissions, but also in cases, right, trying to increase the carbon that gets sequestered in soil is another key part of this. From an enteric methane emissions perspective, we can have technologies that can directly reduce enteric methane, cow burps, if you will, right? They come from the animals. And also indirect strategies in terms of indirectly via production efficiency, lowering the enteric methane emissions per unit of milk. From a manure emissions perspective, right, there's a lot of opportunities there with manure treatment, especially things like anaerobic digestion, right, to actually both produce renewable energy and dramatically reduce methane emissions from manure. And then anything that we can do on farm to reduce fossil energy use, right, or use zero carbon emitting energy sources on the farm can reduce that farm energy piece of the contribution as well. So I mentioned production efficiency, right, or just overall the relationship between productivity and greenhouse gas emission intensity is fairly well known, and it's a fairly dramatic inverse relationship, right? So this is just showing you from UNFAO data, each one of these dots on the scatter plot is a country average. And so on the y-axis, we have kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. So again, an intensity metric. And then on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, we have the actual kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk that get produced by a cow in a year, right? So the annual milk production. As a cow produces more milk per year, the amount of emissions that get produced per unit of milk go down, right? That's a fairly strong relationship. And it's even more dramatic when we have really low producing herds in countries in the world. So anything that we can do to improve productivity tends to lower emissions per unit of milk. So what are some of those things that we can do, right? We know the basics of all cow care, cow comfort, of nutrition of the animals, the genetic merit of the animals. All of these things are incredibly important for improving productivity, as is animal health, right? So this is just a sampling of some of the literature that's out there. It's a small body of literature, but it is growing in terms of looking at this relationship between the health status of the animal and essentially its emissions, or if we can reduce disease states, how can we avoid emissions, right, is another way to think about it. So as you look at this table, right, these are three different health issues on dairy. So we got lameness, so looking at digital dermatitis, laminitis, right, essentially subclinical ketosis, and then subclinical mastitis. And so what these studies are looking at is over on the right-hand side of the scenarios, right? So where they took place, right? In the Netherlands, a couple of these, one in Norway, and then just comparing, either having no foot lesions compared to industry averages, right? What if you could dramatically reduce lameness? What if you could have no subclinical ketosis? And what if you could lower your somatic cell count, right? What difference does that make to the intensity, the greenhouse gas emission intensity of milk? And that's what's in the middle column there, right? So for example, lameness, if you can lower the incidence of lameness down to nothing, right, you would avoid an equivalent of 1.5% increase in the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of milk, right? So we're looking at somewhere anywhere between these, right, 1.5 to almost 4% emissions, right? So these aren't huge contributions, but they're substantial in terms of their co-benefits, right? This is a great story to tell from a sustainability standpoint because you're improving the welfare of animals, you're improving the health status of animals, and you're reducing emissions at the same time, right? So this is one of these powerful synergies when it comes to sustainability, and quite frankly, you're probably also improving your economic sustainability, right? So sometimes there are win-win-wins, and from an animal health perspective, that is a great example that it is when it comes to sustainability. So what just about a hypothetical, right? We talk about net zero, how low could you go, right? And this is just a disclaimer. This is a hypothetical example, right, of the main emission sources on a dairy farm. I've got some information down at the bottom there of just what is in this scenario, right? About 1,100 cow dairy, based in, probably the northeastern area in New York, right? If we have a baseline carbon footprint of almost 1.2, right? Fairly standard for the industry in terms of kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. You can see on this left-hand side on the baseline, right, where those emissions are coming from. So we got in blue enteric. In the orange, we have the emissions that are coming from manure, which is actually dominant in this scenario because we have it mostly managed in an anaerobic lagoon, from the feed, and then from electricity use, okay? So in this again, completely hypothetical scenario, just to say what is possible, right? What if we switch on this dairy to all the manure gets managed on an anaerobic digester, okay? And we start feeding an ionophore, and we feed a methane inhibitor, a theoretical methane inhibitor that reduces enteric methane by 40%, okay? We're just gonna say this is, again, a hypothetical. And what if we could also pull all of our energy off the grid that is now zero carbon, right? We live next to a nuclear energy plant, and there's no carbon coming from our electricity, right? Whatever the scenario may be. So you can see what a dramatic difference that makes, right? That lowers the carbon footprint of milk 56%. We're still not to zero, right? And I've put here, what would you actually need to do to get to zero? Well, you'd have to lower your feed, right, footprint. So that could be lowering the emissions that come from feed, and then again, offsetting some of these emissions that remain with carbon sequestration potentially, right? Whether it's through no-till, cover crops, that would actually you could document change of increasing soil carbon sequestration, right? So again, even with all these changes, you don't quite get to zero, but hopefully it makes it clear of what are those type of things that would need to be changed in this hypothetical to actually get you a lot closer to net zero greenhouse gas emission production on a dairy. And the last thing I'll say is, sometimes I think we've adopted this language of net zero, but there is some more complexity to it, right? So I mentioned that methane gives some bang for the buck in terms of really reducing those emissions. And what is well recognized even by the IPCC is that methane emissions, they don't actually have to be zero to have zero additional warming impact, right? This is something that has been well known. But when we look at the traditional way of all these charts that I've showed you in the preceding presentation of greenhouse gas emissions, I'm using CO2 equivalents, and actually they're not valid if we have lowering methane emissions, right? So this topic itself is kind of complex, but I've taken a couple screenshots here, and especially this one that says net zero for agriculture. This white paper from Oxford University is really kind of helpful in terms of explaining this. But the main takeaway here is that methane is short-lived. It is a potent greenhouse gas, which is absolutely well known. It does trap heat more potently than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but the half-life of methane is much shorter than carbon dioxide. It only hangs out in the atmosphere for roughly 10 or 12 years, right? Most of the methane gets degraded after that time. So the reason that's important is because this Oxford research group has come up with a new measure of CO2 warming equivalents, right? So the key thing here is that if methane emissions are stable, or if methane emissions are declining, the warming impact of each kilogram of CO2 equivalents, or CO2 of methane, excuse me, sorry to confuse the issue, of methane that gets emitted will be less. At the same time, this new scheme of CO2 warming equivalents actually probably better represents the challenging issue of if methane emissions are increasing, that's not a good thing, right, from a climate impact perspective because of the higher radiative forcing potential of methane. So hopefully that makes sense. And I present some of this data on the next couple of slides. The key thing is that all this that you may have heard about methane in terms of how it's accounted for is not a get out of jail free card for animal agriculture by any means or for dairy. Rather, it's just a further incentive for us to cut emissions because it makes a more immediate impact on the climate situation. So just for example, again, we got a lot of data here and a lot of charts, but if we just look over to the left-hand side, this is essentially zooming in on the trends from the EPA of greenhouse gas emissions that come from dairy directly. So this is just like what I showed you earlier, but this is now just zoomed in to 2010 to 2018. So again, we have in blue our enteric emissions, in green our manure methane emissions, and then our nitrous oxide emissions. Now with this new CO2 warming equivalence perspective, what we do is actually compare methane emissions to what they were. In this case, I'm looking at 20 years ago, right? And hopefully you recall what I told you about manure methane emissions in the United States, they've increased, right? So this is actually, that's not a good scenario, right? If we have increasing methane emissions, we've had an increased warming impact. And you can see that if you look over on the right-hand side, right? If I'm expressing these things as CO2 warming equivalents and equivalents, we have million metric tons, right? Notice the difference on the y-axis in this scenario, where we actually have increased the total warming equivalence impact of the US dairy industry because we have this increasing methane issue, right? So again, this is part of that incentive. We want to actually not have an increasing impact. We want to try to get ourselves to zero impact. So what does that mean, right? Again, that means that we need to cut methane emissions from the US dairy industry. So again, this is a hypothetical. What if we could cut emissions, right? What if we could cut emissions from both enteric methane and manure methane at a constant rate of 0.4% per year? Not dramatically huge, right? But 0.4% per year all the way from now until 2050. What would that do to the warming impact of the US dairy industry, right? So again, on the left-hand side, we're just looking at CO2 equivalents, the old school way of looking at it. You can see this very steady linear trend, right? Because this is 0.4% per year. But what does that mean for the warming impacts of the dairy industry? You'll notice a lot more dramatic decline, right, over time. And that by about 2038, in this hypothetical example, the direct emissions from the US dairy industry have no further warming impact, right? So the whole takeaway of this and what's important is to say that what we need to do, what we need to focus on is reducing methane emissions, right? Practical, cost-effective ways if we want to achieve net zero climate impact. But the other takeaway is that methane emissions don't actually have to get to zero to have no further warming impact. So a caveat to the net zero discussion, right? We should still aspire to achieve net zero, but maybe net zero climate impacts and realize that we can't ever make cattle no longer ruminants, right? They're going to emit some methane, and that's fine. What we want to do is stabilize those emissions and slightly decrease them over time, and we'll be able to achieve this noble goal of net zero by the time frame if we can achieve that. So a bottom line and a takeaway, right? Sustainability itself is complex. It's about balancing these three main areas of environment, social, and economic. And first and foremost, right, we have to be economically viable if we're going to be sustainable. We have to balance that with environmental stewardship and social responsibility. But hopefully it's key that ruminant products, they are sustainable, right? They are a key part of a sustainable food system. This upcycling service that cattle provide is incredibly important, along with their benefits on land and soil health, right? So they're really key critters to have in our food system. The animals themselves provide nutrient-rich, nutrient-dense food, right? We know animal source foods are incredibly important. Dairy foods in particular provide key essential nutrients, micronutrients, the ones that are of actual concern both in countries that are developed like the United States and developing countries around the world. So they're incredibly important. But livestock themselves, they provide more than just food, right? They provide livelihoods, they provide all sorts of byproducts that come from them. They're incredibly important animals. Where we're at currently, US dairy is around 2% of US greenhouse gas emissions from a life cycle perspective, but we can reduce that, right? We have options on the table and we have a lot of great work that's happening. Animal health and well-being are part of that solution, right? They're not going to be the biggest chunk, but they're going to be a great co-benefit of improving the welfare of animals at the same time as reducing emissions if we can improve animal health. And really the key opportunity here is if we can reduce methane emissions, right? Reducing methane emissions, increasing soil carbon sequestration are the two big levers we have to pull to get us to a net zero situation, whether it's from manure or from the animals themselves when it comes to methane. So with that, thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussion and hearing from the other presenters.